There is something deeply misleading about the way we imagine medieval blacksmiths. We picture brute strength, sweat, a hammer crashing down on glowing metal, and from that image, a modern assumption is born. This was a physical trade, learned by repetition, mastered in a few years. But medieval Europe did not treat blacksmithing that way at all. In reality, a boy could enter a forge at the age of 12, spend every day beside the fire, inhale smoke until his lungs burned, and still, at 30, be forbidden to stand the forge alone. Not because he was weak, not because he was lazy, but because society did not yet trust him with the fire. That single fact should make us uncomfortable. Why would a world obsessed with survival, efficiency, and scarcity willingly spend decades training one craftsman, when tools were desperately needed, wars were constant, and labor was precious? What were they protecting themselves from? To understand this, we must discard a modern illusion, that a forge is a tool. To a medieval mind, the forge was not a machine. It was a living system, unstable, dangerous, and capable of irreversible damage. Fire, in the modern world, is obedient. We dial it up. We dial it down. We measure it in degrees. In the Middle Ages, fire had no numbers. Its temperature was read by color, not measurement. Its mood was heard in the sound of air and flame. Its health was smelled. Too much sulfur, too little oxygen, damp charcoal, dying heat. A forge could not be set. It had to be felt. And feeling it required years of silent observation. This is why apprentices spent endless hours doing what looks, to modern eyes, like nothing at all. Turning bellows, cleaning slag, fetching fuel, watching. They were not being exploited. They were being conditioned. Their nervous systems were learning patterns no book could describe. Because once iron reaches the fire, time collapses. A second too long, and the steel burns. A moment too early, and it cracks under the hammer. There is no rewind. Modern manufacturing tolerates error. Medieval forging did not. But fire was only half the danger. The other half was the metal itself. Medieval steel was not standardized. There were no grades, no certifications, no chemical consistency. Each billet carried unknown carbon content, hidden impurities, invisible stress points. Two pieces that looked identical could behave like different substances entirely. The blacksmith did not apply a method. He read a material. By spark, by resistance under the hammer, by how it cooled, by how it screamed when quenched. A mistake here was not cosmetic. A failed plowshare could doom a harvest. A flawed horseshoe could cripple transport. A weak sword could kill its owner when it shattered in combat. The forge produced objects that carried lives downstream. This is the key fact modern minds often miss. Medieval blacksmiths were not making products. They were producing consequences. This is why standing the forge alone was not about skill. It was about trust. A master did not ask, "Can you shape metal?" He asked, "Will your judgment hold when no one is watching?" Because once entrusted with the fire, a blacksmith made decisions that could not be supervised in real time. By the time a flaw revealed itself, it was already too late. There were no recalls, no replacements, no disclaimers. If a tool failed, the blame traced back to one man and followed him for life. Reputation was not branding. It was survival. A village with a bad blacksmith did not get lower quality tools. It got hunger, injury, death. This is why medieval societies accepted long apprenticeships without complaint. They were not slow. They were risk-aware. Notice something profound here. The training was long not because the knowledge was complicated, but because the stakes were absolute. You were not trained until you had seen fire behave unpredictably, metal betray expectation, tiny errors become disasters. Only after witnessing enough failure, often not your own, Did you earn the right to risk causing it? This is why observation preceded action, why silence preceded authority, why patience preceded power. The forge did not forgive confidence, it punished it. There is another layer, rarely discussed. Blacksmithing was not merely technical, it was systemic. The smith stood at the intersection of agriculture, warfare, infrastructure, trade. Every system depended on his outputs. To train a blacksmith too quickly was not an individual gamble. It was a systemic vulnerability. Medieval societies understood something modern systems often forget. When one role carries disproportionate downstream impact, speed is not efficiency. It is recklessness. So they slowed the process deliberately. They stretched it across decades to filter out not just incompetence, but temperament. Could this person endure monotony? Could he wait? Could he resist shortcuts when no one was watching? These traits mattered more than talent. This brings us to the real reason decades were required. The forge demanded a different relationship with time. Modern training asks, how fast can you perform? Medieval training asked, how long can you refrain from acting? Standing the forge was not the reward for learning techniques. It was the acknowledgement that you had internalized restraint, that you understood that power without patience destroys systems. And now, a disturbing question emerges. If a medieval village, poor, violent, technologically limited, believed it was dangerous to trust a man with fire too early, what does it say about modern societies that entrust people with vastly more complex systems after only a few years of instruction? Systems where errors are abstract, consequences are delayed, responsibility is diffused. The medieval blacksmith stood alone with his mistake. No committee, no policy, no insulation, only consequence. Perhaps the decades were not excessive. Perhaps they were the cost of living in a world where errors were real and responsibility could not be hidden. This is not a story about nostalgia. It is a warning about what happens when systems grow more powerful, while training grows shorter and accountability thinner. In the next part, we will examine how guilds, oaths, and professional honor enforced this discipline, and how the collapse of those structures changed not just craftsmanship, but the way society relates to responsibility itself. If the forge was dangerous, the guild was the containment system built around it. To modernize, medieval guilds are often misunderstood as trade unions or economic cartels. But this misses their primary function. Guilds were not designed to protect craftsmen from the market. They were designed to protect society from unready craftsmen. A blacksmith was never trained in isolation. He was shaped inside a social structure that enforced patience, restraint, and moral weight, long before skill was even evaluated. This is why training took decades, not because no one learned faster, but because learning faster was irrelevant. The apprenticeship system was intentionally asymmetric. An apprentice owed everything: labor, loyalty, obedience, silence. In return, the master owed only one thing: judgment. Not kindness, not speed, judgment. A master could delay promotion for years without explanation, and no one questioned it. Why? Because promotion was not proof of competence. It was proof of trustworthiness under uncertainty. The medieval world did not ask, "Can you do this correctly?" It asked, "What will you do when no one can see the mistake?" This is why most of an apprentice's early years were structurally humiliating. They did not touch critical work. They were not praised. They were not given authorship. They cleaned. They waited. They watched others fail. The purpose was psychological. The guild needed to know, would this person grow resentful? Would he seek shortcuts? Would he resent authority once he felt capable? Because a resentful blacksmith was more dangerous than an unskilled one. Skill could be corrected, temperament could not. After years, often more than a decade, an apprentice might become a journeyman. Modern interpretations romanticize this stage as freedom. In reality, it was extended probation. A journeyman could work, but he could not establish a forge. He could not take apprentices. He could not act autonomously. He moved from town to town, working under different masters. This wandering was not about exploration. It was about exposure. Each forge was different. Each master enforced different standards. Each failure followed the journeyman like a shadow. This phase tested adaptability, humility, and consistency. Only those who remained stable across environments were considered for mastery. Again, not speed, durability. To become a master, a blacksmith had to present a masterpiece. This is often misunderstood as a test of artistic skill. It was not. The masterpiece was a liability test. It asked, can you plan? Can you source materials responsibly? Can you control variables you do not fully understand? Can you produce something that will survive use? And more importantly, can you stake your reputation on it? Because the masterpiece was not anonymous. If it failed, everyone knew whose judgment had failed. This is why some candidates waited years before even attempting it. They were not afraid of failure. They were afraid of premature responsibility. But the deepest control mechanism was not technical. It was moral. Guilds enforced oaths, not symbolic pledges, but binding social contracts. A blacksmith swore not to undercut quality for profit, not to hide flaws, not to teach unproven methods, not to train apprentices irresponsibly. Breaking these oaths did not lead to fines. It led to exile. No guild membership meant no clients, no supplies, no protection. In effect, professional death. This is crucial. Medieval societies did not rely on oversight. They relied on irreversible consequences. Now notice the pattern. Every layer of the system slowed things down. Apprenticeship delayed action. Journeyman years delayed independence. Mastery required public risk. Oaths enforced lifetime accountability. This was not inefficiency. It was containment. The system assumed that human error was inevitable and designed itself to absorb it before it reached society. This is the opposite of modern training logic. Today, we accelerate access and manage failure later. The medieval world delayed access, so failure rarely escaped containment. And here is the uncomfortable realization. Nothing about blacksmithing required decades to learn. What required decades was learning when not to act. Learning to pause when confidence surged. Learning to distrust shortcuts. Learning to respect invisible downstream effects. These things do not scale. They do not compress. They do not respond to efficiency incentives. They require time lived under restraint. So when we ask, why did medieval blacksmiths train for so long? The real answer is not, because they were primitive. It is, because they understood that power matures slower than skill, and they refused to confuse the two. In the final part, we will confront the collapse of this philosophy, how industrialization severed responsibility from consequence, why training shortened as systems grew more powerful, and what the medieval forge still reveals about modern risk we no longer see. When the industrial age arrived, blacksmiths did not suddenly become obsolete. They became dangerous in a new way, not because they lacked skill, but because the system around them changed faster than the ethics that once constrained it. The forge did not disappear. Responsibility did. Industrialization did one thing extraordinarily well. It separated action from consequence. Where the medieval blacksmith saw the farmer who used his plow, the industrial worker saw a quota. Where failure once meant hunger, injury, or death, failure now meant a report, a delay, a replacement. Mistakes no longer carried faces, and once consequence became abstract, training inevitably shortened. Not because people became careless, but because systems stopped demanding care. In medieval society, responsibility flowed downward. The man who made the object bore the weight of its use. In industrial society, responsibility flows sideways and upward. Designers blame materials, workers blame instructions, managers blame policy. Systems blame unexpected outcomes. No one stands alone with the fire anymore, so no one is trained to. This shift explains something critical. The long training of medieval blacksmiths was not a technological necessity. It was a moral architecture. It existed to ensure that those who controlled dangerous systems could not hide, could not rush, could not externalize blame. Once that architecture collapsed, speed became possible. And once speed became possible, it became mandatory. This is why modern training often feels inverted. People are given power early, then taught restraint later, if at all. We trust systems to catch errors instead of people to prevent them. But medieval societies did not trust systems. They trusted slowly shaped humans. Because systems fail silently, humans hesitate. And hesitation, in dangerous domains, is not weakness. It is intelligence. The medieval forge trained something we no longer measure. Not output, not efficiency, but judgment under irreversible conditions. Judgment that only forms when errors cannot be hidden. Reputation cannot be reset. Time cannot be compressed. This is why decades mattered. You were not waiting to learn more. You were waiting to become someone who could be trusted not to act when action was tempting. Look at the world now. We entrust individuals with financial systems affecting millions, technologies altering ecosystems, decisions whose consequences unfold decades later. And we do so after training periods shorter than a medieval apprenticeship. Not because we are wiser, but because consequences are delayed enough to be politically survivable. The medieval world did not have that luxury. So the question, why did medieval blacksmiths train for decades, is actually a mirror. It asks, what kind of society requires slow humans? And the uncomfortable follow-up, what kind of society can afford fast ones? The medieval forge answers quietly. When consequences are immediate and personal, training becomes long, patience becomes mandatory, and power is given only to those who have learned restraint. When consequences are distant and distributed, speed feels safe until it isn't. This is not nostalgia. It is a warning preserved in iron and fire, a reminder that some kinds of competence cannot be rushed and some kinds of responsibility cannot be outsourced to systems, no matter how advanced they appear. The forge knew this. That is why it waited decades.